what happens when a species that has never known defeat encounters the one force in the universe they never saw coming. For 12,000 years, the Zelkari Empire has crushed every civilization that dared to resist. Their fleets have turned entire star systems to ash. Their warriors have never retreated from any battlefield. They are the apex predators of the galaxy, and every species knows their place beneath the Zelkari boot. But in a small, unremarkable solar system on the edge of nowhere, something impossible is about to happen. A young species called humanity is about to teach the greatest empire in galactic history a lesson they will never forget. This is not a story about superior technology or overwhelming numbers. This is a story about what happens when unstoppable force meets the one thing the Zelkari never learned to understand: the human spirit that refuses to break, no matter the odds. The beginning of the end started the moment the first Zelkari scout ship detected radio signals from a blue planet called Earth. They just didn't know it yet. Admiral Kethvar stood before the massive viewing port of the dreadnought Eternal Dominion, watching as another world burned beneath his fleet. The orange glow of dying cities reflected off his metallic scales, a sight that had become as familiar to him as breathing. 12,000 years of conquest had taught the Zelkari Empire that resistance was futile, and Admiral Kethvar had personally overseen the subjugation of 47 species during his 3-century career. "Status report," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known defeat. The bridge crew, each member representing the finest of Zelkari military tradition, snapped to attention. "Sir, the Miran civilization has ceased all resistance," reported Commander Veltum, her claws clicking against the tactical display. "The remaining population centers are requesting terms of surrender." Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what passed for satisfaction among his species. The Marins had lasted exactly 14 standard days against the Zelkari war machine, longer than most but still pathetically brief. Their crystalline cities, once considered marvels of engineering, now lay in ruins across 3 continents. "Standard occupation protocols," he ordered without emotion. "Preserve 20% of the population for labor integration. Eliminate the rest." As his subordinates began coordinating the final phase of conquest, Kethvar reflected on the inevitable nature of Zelkari dominance. Every species they encountered followed the same pattern: initial defiance, brief resistance, and finally complete capitulation. It had been this way since the first Zelkari ships had left their homeworld of Zereth Prime millennia ago. Their empire now spanned 800 star systems, encompassing nearly 3,000 inhabited worlds. The secret to their success was simple: overwhelming superiority in every aspect of warfare. Zelkari warriors stood 3 meters tall, with natural armor plating and strength that could crush most species barehanded. Their technology had been refined through centuries of constant warfare, creating weapons and ships that outclassed anything their enemies could field. Most importantly, they possessed an absolute unity of purpose that made them unstoppable as a military force. "Admiral," called out Lieutenant Zexmer from the communication station, "we're receiving a transmission from High Command on Zereth Prime." The massive holographic display flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Supreme War Marshal Thekran. Even among the Zelkari, Thekran was considered exceptional, a strategic genius who had overseen the conquest of the entire Andromeda sector. His battle-scarred carapace told the story of 1,000 victories, and his cold yellow eyes held the wisdom of absolute power. "Admiral Kethvar," Thekran's voice rumbled across the bridge, "congratulations on another successful campaign. These entire roads will make valuable additions to the Empire." "Thank you, War Marshal." Proceeded exactly as planned. "We encountered no significant challenges." "Excellent. Your next assignment has already been prepared." The display shifted to show star charts of an unexplored region. Detected radio emissions from a previously unknown system. Designation: Sol. Designation: Sol. The initial scans indicate a species in the early stages of technological development. Kethvar studied the tactical data with professional interest. The system contained one inhabited world, a blue planet orbiting a yellow star. Preliminary analysis suggested a species that had achieved basic spaceflight and nuclear technology, but nothing that would pose even a minimal threat to Zelkari forces. "Estimated resistance level?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Negligible," Thekran replied. Intelligence suggests they call themselves humans. Carbon-based bipeds, average height 1.8 meters, no natural armor or enhanced physical capabilities. Their technology appears to be approximately 8 centuries behind our current capabilities. Standard subjugation timeline? Reconnaissance indicates their population is distributed across multiple continents on a single world. Today, initial estimates suggest complete pacification within 3 to 5 standard days. However, there is one factor that makes this assignment particularly important. The star chart zoomed in to show the Sol system's location relative to major galactic trade routes. Cathvar immediately understood the strategic significance. Gateway position, he observed. Precisely. This system sits at the intersection of 3 major hyperspace lanes that we will need for our expansion into the Outer Rim territories. The humans are merely an inconvenience that must be removed before we can establish a proper military base. Cathvar nodded his understanding. Throughout their expansion, the Zelkari had encountered dozens of species occupying strategically valuable systems. The solution was always the same: swift conquest, followed by either integration or elimination. The humans would be no different. Timeline for departure? Immediately. Intelligence reports suggest the humans are on the verge of developing faster-than-light communication technology. We cannot allow them to contact other species and potentially form alliances. You will take the 7th Fleet and establish complete control over the Sol system within 1 standard month. Understood, War Marshal. Glory to the Empire. Glory to the Empire, Thekrin responded before the transmission ended. As the bridge crew began preparations for departure, Cathvar allowed himself a moment of anticipation. After the drawn-out campaign against the Morans, a quick conquest would be refreshing. From everything he had seen, these humans would barely qualify as a proper military exercise. 30. Commander Veltham, he called out, prepare the fleet for immediate departure. Standard conquest formation. Sir, how many ships shall we deploy for this operation? Cathvar considered the question for barely a moment. 50 vessels should be more than sufficient. No point in bringing the entire fleet for such a minor operation. Within 6 hours, the 7th Fleet had assembled in formation around the Eternal Dominion. 50 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy, each one capable of reducing a planet's surface to molten slag. The smallest vessels were destroyers that dwarfed most species' largest battleships, while the flagship itself was a mobile fortress that had never suffered so much as a scratch in 3 centuries of warfare. As the fleet prepared to enter hyperspace, Cathvar reviewed the intelligence files on humanity one final time. The species appeared to be divided into multiple competing nation-states, suggesting they lacked the unity that had made the Zelkari so dominant. Their weapons were primitive projectile and chemical explosives, utterly incapable of penetrating Zelkari armor or shielding. Pictor, most telling of all, they had no orbital defenses worthy of the name and only the most basic understanding of space warfare. Hyperspace jump coordinates confirmed, reported the navigation officer. Estimated travel time to Sol system, 47 standard hours. Initiate jump, Cathvar commanded. The stars stretched into lines of light as the Zelkari fleet leaped across the galaxy toward their next conquest. In the quiet of hyperspace, Cathvar found himself reflecting on the nature of warfare and dominance. Every species they had encountered had possessed some unique strength. The Neurons had their crystal technology, the Vorthak had their telepathic coordination, the Drexeli had their incredible engineering skills, yet none of these advantages had proved sufficient against Zelkari's superiority. He wondered briefly what unique characteristic the humans might possess, then dismissed the thought as irrelevant. Whatever small advantages they might have would crumble before the reality of Zelkari power, just as it always did. In his private quarters later that evening, Cathvar reviewed historical records of previous conquests, analyzing patterns and tactical approaches. One report caught his attention. A psychological analysis of resistance movements from conquered species. The document noted that younger civilizations often exhibited what Zelkari scientists termed irrational defiance syndrome, a tendency to continue fighting even when victory was mathematically impossible. The analysis suggested this trait typically faded within a generation once the conquered species learned to accept their new reality. The humans, being a primitive species, would likely exhibit this syndrome in its most extreme form. They might even attempt to resist after their military forces had been eliminated, forcing the Zelkari to spend additional time on pacification efforts. Kethvar made a note to prepare for extended urban warfare scenarios, though he doubted they would be necessary. Previous experience suggested that once a species witnessed the true power of the Zelkari military, rational leaders quickly emerged to negotiate surrender terms. The fleet continued its journey through hyperspace, carrying with it the absolute confidence of an empire that had never known defeat. Dasik. Behind them, the ashes of the Miran worlds cooled in space, another footnote in the long history of Zelkari expansion. Ahead of them waited a small blue planet whose inhabitants had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. As the Eternal Dominion hurtled toward its destination, Admiral Kethvar began drafting preliminary occupation protocols for the Sol system. He estimated they would need approximately 3,000 ground troops to maintain order after the initial conquest, along with a permanent fleet presence to guard the strategic hyperspace routes. The human population could be reduced to manageable levels and relocated to designated preservation zones where they would be unable to interfere with Zelkari operations. It was a plan he had implemented successfully dozens of times before. There was no reason to expect this operation would be any different. The journey to Sol's system proceeded without incident, giving the fleet time to conduct final preparations and briefings. Kethvar held daily strategy sessions with his senior officers, reviewing intelligence data and refining their approach based on the most recent scout reports. The intelligence picture that emerged painted a picture of a species caught in the transition between primitive planetary civilization and true spacefaring culture. But the humans had achieved basic orbital flight and established small outposts on their system's natural satellite, but their technology remained laughably inferior to Zelkari standards. Their largest warships were barely the size of Zelkari transport vessels, armed with weapons that would be unable to penetrate even the lightest Zelkari armor. Most importantly, the humans appeared to be completely unaware of the existence of galactic civilization. They had received no warnings, formed no alliances, and developed no defenses against the kind of warfare the Zelkari had perfected over millennia. They would be facing an enemy whose very existence was beyond their comprehension. As the fleet prepared to drop out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, Admiral Kethvar felt the familiar satisfaction that came with the beginning of a new conquest. In less than a week, the human species would join the long list of civilizations that had learned to kneel before Zelkari power. He had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter something no Zelkari had ever faced before, a species that simply refused to understand when they had been beaten. The klaxons aboard the International Space Station had been wailing for 17 minutes. When Commander Sarah Chen finally managed to establish contact with Mission Control Houston. Through the static-filled transmission, she could barely make out the voice of Flight Director Marcus Rodriguez, but his words sent ice through her veins. ISS, we have confirmation of multiple unknown contacts entering the outer system. These are not natural phenomena. Repeat, we have unknown artificial objects moving toward Earth at velocities that should be impossible. Sarah floated in the cupola module, staring out at the star field where moments ago everything had been normal. Down, even without telescopic assistance, she could see them, points of light where no points of light should exist, growing steadily brighter as they approached the inner solar system. Houston ISS. Perp. How many contacts are we talking about? The pause before Rodriguez's response told her everything she needed to know. ISS, we're tracking 50. One distinct objects. Largest contact is approximately 4 kilometers in length. They're moving in perfect formation and decelerating in a manner that suggests intelligence. Dr. James Peterson, the mission's astrophysicist, drifted up beside her. His normally calm demeanor had cracked, and his hands shook as he activated the station's most powerful telescope array. Within minutes, the first images began coming through on the station's computers. What they saw defied every assumption humanity had made about its place in the universe. The ships, for there was no doubt they were ships, moved with the grace of predators and the precision of a military formation that had been drilled to perfection. Each vessel was a work of art in metallic death, their hulls gleaming with an alien aesthetic that spoke of technology centuries beyond human capability. The largest ship, clearly the flagship, bristled with weapon systems that dwarfed anything in Earth's arsenal. "My God," Peterson whispered, Sarah, we need to get this data to Earth immediately. The acceleration curves, the formation patterns, the sheer scale, this is a military fleet, and it's heading straight for us. Back on Earth, the world was beginning to wake up to a new reality. In the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center, General Patricia Hayes stood before a wall of screens, displaying tracking data from every military satellite and deep space monitoring station on the planet. The picture they painted was clear. Humanity was about to receive visitors, and those visitors had not come in peace. Update on the foreign fleet's position, she commanded. Ma'am, current velocity suggests they'll reach Earth orbit in approximately 68 hours, reported Colonel Thompson from the tactical station. Deceleration patterns indicate they possess propulsion technology we can't even begin to understand. Any response to our communication attempts? Negative. We've broadcast on every frequency in every format we can think of. Mathematical sequences, prime numbers, the universal hydrogen frequency, nothing. They're either ignoring us or they simply don't care to respond. General Hayes had spent 30 years in the military, rising through the ranks during humanity's brief period of relative peace. She had studied every military conflict in human history, analyzed every strategy and tactic that had ever been employed. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. Current assessment of hostile intent? Ma'am, their approach vector takes them directly to Earth, with no deviation for communication or diplomacy. They're maintaining a combat formation throughout deceleration. Every analysis suggests this is a military operation. Around the globe, similar scenes were playing out in command centers and government facilities. In Moscow, Beijing, London, and every other capital city, military leaders were coming to the same terrifying conclusion. Humanity was about to face an enemy whose capabilities were so far beyond their own that conventional warfare might be meaningless. President Elizabeth Morrison sat in the White House Situation Room, surrounded by the finest military and scientific minds America could assemble. The briefing she had just received painted a picture that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about the universe. The protocol. Dr. Williams, she addressed the head of NASA. What's your scientific assessment of these ships? Dr. Williams, normally unflappable, looked pale as he consulted his notes. Madam President, based on their approach velocity and deceleration curves, these vessels possess propulsion systems that operate on principles we don't understand. The energy requirements alone should be impossible according to our current physics models. And the material science? The largest ship is 4 kilometers long and maintaining structural integrity under accelerations that should tear any known material apart. What about their weapons capability? Unknown, but based on the sheer scale of these vessels, we have to assume they could devastate our planet with conventional weapons alone. A 4-kilometer ship moving at orbital velocity would carry more kinetic energy than our entire nuclear arsenal. The president turned to General Hayes, who had joined the meeting via secure video link. General, what are our defensive options? Ma'am, I have to be honest with you. Against conventional Earth-based threats, we have the finest military in human history. Against this, we might as well be throwing rocks at a hurricane. Surely we have something. Nuclear weapons, orbital platforms, something that could make a difference. General Hayes' expression was grim. Our most advanced interceptor missiles can barely reach low Earth orbit. Our nuclear arsenal is designed to target fixed positions or slow-moving aircraft. These ships are operating with technology that's centuries beyond anything we possess. It would be like the Spanish conquistadors facing a modern aircraft carrier. The room fell silent as the full implications settled in. For the first time in human history, they faced an enemy against whom their weapons might be completely useless. In the meantime, across the globe, humanity began to react in ways that would have surprised the approaching Zelkari fleet. Instead of panic and despair, a strange transformation was taking place. Military personnel reported for duty in record numbers, even when off-duty or on leave. Scientists worked around the clock to find any possible technological solution. Ordinary citizens began volunteering for any organization that might help with the crisis. Dr. Lisa Chang, working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, had not slept in 36 hours. Her team was frantically analyzing every scrap of data from the approaching fleet, looking for any weakness or vulnerability they might exploit. The power signatures are unlike anything we've ever seen, she reported to her supervisor via video conference. Energy than small stars. But there are patterns in their emissions that suggest they might be using some form of directed energy weapon system. Asking about it, not with current technology, but there might be a possibility. If we could somehow disrupt their power distribution systems or create electromagnetic interference on a massive scale, what would that require? Something we don't have. Every nuclear reactor on Earth working in coordination, plus every power grid, plus some way to focus all that energy into a coherent electromagnetic pulse? It's theoretical at best. Reports of similar conversations were taking place in research facilities around the world. At CERN, physicists were exploring whether the Large Hadron Collider could be weaponized. In Japan, engineers were calculating whether their advanced robotics could be rapidly converted to military purposes. In Israel, programmers were attempting to develop computer viruses that might affect alien technology. The common thread in all these efforts was a refusal to accept defeat before the battle had even begun. While the approaching fleet represented overwhelming technological superiority, humanity was responding with something the Zalkari had never encountered: absolute determination combined with innovative thinking born from desperation. Captain Maria Rodriguez of the U.S. Air Force found herself assigned to what was being called the Impossible Mission Team, a group of pilots, engineers, and tacticians tasked with finding ways to use Earth's existing military assets against enemies that outclassed them by centuries. All right, people. She addressed her team in the hastily converted conference room at Edwards Air Force Base. I know what we're up against. I know the odds. But we're going to find a way to hurt these things when they arrive. Sir, ma'am, interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Stevens. With respect, our best fighter aircraft can't even reach the altitude where these ships are operating. How exactly are we supposed to engage them? We get creative. We think outside every box we've ever known. These aliens might have superior technology, but they don't know how humans fight. They don't know how we think. They don't know that we've spent our entire history figuring out ways to kill things that are bigger and stronger than we are. She pulled up displays showing the alien fleet's formation and approach vector. Look at this. Perfect formation, predictable patterns, military precision. They're so confident in their superiority that they're not even taking basic evasive measures. They think we're no threat at all, aren't they right? Maybe. Underestimating an enemy has been the first step toward defeat. These aliens have been conquering primitive species for thousands of years. They've never faced anyone who fought back with the kind of desperation that comes from protecting your home, your family, your entire species. As the alien fleet continued its approach toward Earth, humanity began preparations that would have puzzled any observer familiar with conventional military tactics. Or attempts to flee the planet, humans were doing something far more dangerous. They were getting angry. In military bases around the world, soldiers were volunteering for missions that had not yet been planned, against enemies they could not yet comprehend, using weapons that had not yet been built. In research laboratories, scientists were pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, seeking solutions that existed only in theory. In cities and towns across the globe, ordinary people were refusing to evacuate or hide, instead organizing themselves into support networks and resistance cells. The approaching Zalkari fleet maintained its steady progress toward Earth, confident in their technological superiority and the inevitable nature of their victory. Admiral Kethvar reviewed the latest intelligence reports, noting the primitive nature of human defenses and the apparent lack of any meaningful resistance preparations. What he failed to understand was that humanity was not preparing for conventional resistance. They were preparing for something the Zalkari Empire had never encountered in 12,000 years of conquest. A species that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The first contact between the Zalkari Empire and humanity was now less than 48 hours away. Neither species truly understood what they were about to face. The Zalkari expected another quick conquest against a primitive species that would crumble before their superior might. They had based this expectation on 12 millennia of experience against hundreds of other civilizations. Humanity expected to lose. Every military analysis, every scientific assessment, every rational evaluation of the situation pointed to the same conclusion. They were about to face an enemy so far beyond their capabilities that victory was mathematically impossible. But humanity had never been particularly concerned with mathematical impossibility. They had a long history of achieving things that should have been beyond their reach, simply because they refused to accept that those things were impossible. As the hours ticked down toward first contact, both species prepared for war in ways that reflected their fundamental natures. The Zelkari prepared with the methodical precision of an empire that had never known defeat. Humanity prepared with the desperate innovation of a species that had never known surrender. The stage was set for a collision between unstoppable force and immovable object. The universe was about to discover which was which. The Zelkari fleet dropped out of hyperspace, at the edge of the Sol system with the precision of a military operation that had been rehearsed countless times across the galaxy. Admiral Kethvar observed the blue planet hanging in space before him, seemingly peaceful and unaware of the doom that had just arrived in their star system. "Begin standard reconnaissance sweep," he commanded from the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. On their defensive capabilities, population centers, and military assets within 6 hours. What the reconnaissance revealed would have amused the Admiral if he had been capable of such emotion. The human military consisted of aircraft that could barely reach their planet's upper atmosphere, waterborne vessels that would have been considered primitive by Zelkari standards 3,000 years ago, and ground-based weapons that fired chemical projectiles. Their most advanced weapons appeared to be fusion bombs that could level cities, impressive by the standards of a young civilization, but utterly useless against Zelkari shielding technology. "Status of orbital defenses?" he inquired. "Negligible," reported Commander Veltham. "They have a small space station in low orbit with no apparent weapons systems and several small satellites that appear to be for communication and observation purposes. No defensive installations of any significance." Kethvar's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The operation would proceed exactly as planned, a quick demonstration of overwhelming force, followed by the inevitable surrender of the human leadership. With any luck, they would be establishing their base of operations within the week. The Communications Broadcast Standard Surrender Ultimatum on all human frequencies. The message that reached Earth was delivered in perfect English, having been translated by the Zelkari's sophisticated linguistic analysis systems during their approach. It appeared simultaneously on every television screen, radio broadcast, and digital display on the planet. "Attention, species designation human," the mechanical voice began. "This is Admiral Kethvar of the Zelkari Empire. Your system has been designated for Imperial integration. You have one rotation of your planet to surrender unconditionally. Designate representatives to negotiate terms of submission. Resistance will result in the elimination of your species. You have been conquered. Accept this reality." The transmission ended, leaving humanity to contemplate the stark choice that had been presented to them. In government buildings around the world, leaders gathered to discuss their response to an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. President Morrison stood before a joint session of Congress that had been called into emergency session. Her words would be broadcast to every nation on Earth, and her tone carried the weight of speaking for the entire human species.
"My fellow Americans and citizens of the world," she began, "we have been given a choice.
Surrender our freedom, our independence, and our right to determine our own destiny, or face annihilation by forces beyond our current ability to resist." She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives who would help decide the fate of humanity. "Throughout our history, we have faced enemies who seemed insurmountable. We have confronted tyranny, oppression, and those who would enslave us. In every case, we have chosen to fight for our freedom, regardless of the odds." The chamber was absolutely silent as she continued. "Today, we face an enemy whose technology surpasses our own by centuries. They have given us 24 hours to surrender. I say to them and to the world that we need not 24 hours to give our answer." Her voice rose, carrying the conviction that had defined humanity throughout its history. "We refuse. We will not kneel. We will not submit. We will not surrender our world, our freedom, or our children's future to any power in this universe. If we must fight, we will fight. If we must die, we will die free." The chamber erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Played out in capitals around the world as humanity delivered its unanimous response to the Zelkari ultimatum. When the message reached Admiral Kethvar, he felt the closest thing to surprise that his species was capable of experiencing. For 12,000 years of conquest, no species had ever refused the surrender ultimatum. Even the most warlike civilizations eventually recognized the futility of resistance once they witnessed Zelkari power. "Commander," he said to Veltham, "confirm that the translation systems were functioning correctly." "Yes, Admiral." The message was clear, that they are refusing to surrender. "Then they have chosen extinction. Begin Phase 2. Across the Earth, humanity had 24 hours to prepare for war against an enemy that could destroy their civilization with ease. What they did with those hours would become the foundation of legends that would be told for generations to come. Rather than panic or despair, humanity responded with a surge of innovation and determination that caught even their own leaders by surprise. Military bases that should have been evacuated were instead reinforced with volunteers. Research facilities that should have been shut down were working at triple capacity. The cities that should have been emptied were organizing civilian defense networks. At the Pentagon, General Hayes was coordinating what she privately considered the most hopeless military operation in human history. Her staff had been working for 18 straight hours devising tactics for a battle they couldn't win. "Ma'am," reported Colonel Thompson, "we've received confirmation that every major military force on Earth is coordinating for the defense. NATO, the Warsaw Pact nations, China, India, even traditionally neutral countries are committing everything they have. What's our total force projection?" "Approximately 4,000 aircraft of various types, 67 naval vessels with missile capability, and 14 submarines with nuclear armament. Ground forces are effectively unlimited. We're seeing volunteer rates that exceed our ability to process enlistments." General Hayes studied the force disposition reports. On paper, it represented the largest military coalition in human history. Against any Earth-based threat, it would be completely overwhelming. Against the Zelkari fleet, it might as well be a collection of museum pieces. Any word from the scientific community on unconventional weapons? Several possibilities, none of them tested. Dr. Chang's team thinks they can create a massive electromagnetic pulse using every nuclear reactor on the planet, but the coordination requirements are enormous and the effects unpredictable. The team at CERN believes they might be able to generate some kind of exotic matter burst, but they estimate a less than 5% chance of success. "What about the kamikaze proposals?" Thompson's expression grew grim. "We've received over 200,000 volunteers for one-way missions. Pilots willing to ram alien ships with nuclear-armed aircraft. Submarine crews volunteering to detonate their vessels as close as possible to enemy targets. Even civilian volunteers offering to deliver nuclear devices manually." General Hayes closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer courage of the response. "How many of those proposals are tactically viable?" "Honestly, ma'am, probably none of them. But the psychological effect on our own forces has been extraordinary. Morale is actually increasing as the deadline approaches. Peoples around the globe, humanity's finest scientific minds were working miracles of innovation under pressure." Dr. Kadnada, Chang's electromagnetic pulse project had grown from a theoretical possibility to a working plan that involved coordinating every power grid on Earth into a single massive weapon. "The principle is sound," she explained to the international team of scientists who had joined the project via secure video link. "If we can synchronize every nuclear reactor, every power plant, every electrical grid on the planet, we might be able to generate an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to disrupt their systems." "What are the risks?" asked Dr. Petrov from the Russian team. "Complete global electrical failure for anywhere from weeks to months. Possibly permanent damage to our own technology. And it might not work at all against their shielding. And if we don't try, then we definitely lose." The decision was made to proceed with the attempt, despite the enormous risks. Around the world, electrical engineers and nuclear technicians began the most complex coordination effort in human history. Per power plant would need to discharge its energy at precisely the same moment, creating a pulse of electromagnetic energy that would be visible from space. As the final hours before the Zelkari attack ticked away, humanity made one last desperate attempt at innovation. If conventional weapons were useless and their most advanced technology was insufficient, then they would have to find a different approach entirely. The solution came from an unexpected source, a video game designer named Kevin Park, who had been following the crisis through social media, impact systems and game theory, led him to propose something that military analysts had overlooked. "You're thinking about this like a conventional war," he argued during an emergency conference call that included military leaders from around the world. These aliens have been conquering primitive civilizations for thousands of years. They expect resistance to follow certain patterns. What if we don't follow those patterns? What do you mean? Asked General Hayes. Every military confrontation they've ever faced has been between organized forces with clear command structures and predictable tactics. What if instead of fighting them like an army, we fight them like humans? The concept that emerged from that conversation would later be called distributed warfare. Instead of massing forces for conventional battles, humanity would scatter its resistance across the entire planet. Every city, every town, every individual human would become part of a resistance network that had no central command structure to destroy and no predictable patterns to counter. Military units would avoid large-scale engagements, instead focusing on hit-and-run tactics designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while preserving human forces. Populations would support these efforts through intelligence networks, supply chains, and communication systems that operated through social media and civilian technology rather than military channels. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it played to humanity's greatest strengths: adaptability, creativity, and an absolute refusal to give up, even when defeat was certain. As the 24-hour deadline approached, Admiral Kethvar prepared to begin the demonstration that would convince the humans to accept their fate. The standard doctrine called for the destruction of a major population center as an object lesson, followed by targeted strikes against military installations until organized resistance collapsed. He selected the city that human communications designated as New York for the initial strike. Its dense population and symbolic importance would maximize the psychological impact on the remaining humans, encouraging them to surrender before further destruction became necessary. Target acquired, reported the weapons officer. Population approximately 8 million, civilian and military targets confirmed. Begin bombardment, Kethvar commanded. The energy beam that lanced down from the Eternal Dominion was designed to completely sterilize the target area. It struck the heart of Manhattan with the force of a small star, creating a crater of molten glass where one of humanity's greatest cities had stood moments before. But as the alien fleet observed the destruction, something unexpected happened. Instead of the panic and chaos that typically followed such demonstrations, the human response was immediate and coordinated. Every remaining military asset on the planet began moving toward predetermined positions. Communication networks that should have collapsed instead began broadcasting calls for resistance. Most surprising of all, instead of surrender negotiations, the Zelkari fleet began receiving direct challenges on their communication frequencies. The messages came not from government officials or military commanders, but from ordinary humans around the world. Factory workers and farmers, teachers and students, people who had never held weapons in their lives were sending defiant messages to the alien fleet. "You destroyed our city," one transmission began, "but you have not destroyed us. You think you have conquered us, but you don't understand what you're fighting. We are not just another species that will kneel before your empire. We are humanity, and we will never stop fighting." Admiral Kethvar stared at the communications display in something approaching confusion. This was not how conquered species were supposed to respond. Where was the panic? Where were the surrender negotiations? Where was the rational recognition that resistance was futile? "Commander," he said to Veltum, "explain these communications." "Unknown, Admiral. The humans appear to be challenging us." It was the first time in his 3-century career that Admiral Kethvar had encountered something that his training and experience had not prepared him for. Every species the Zelkari had ever conquered had followed predictable patterns of behavior when faced with overwhelming force. The humans were doing something different. They were acting as if they actually believed they could win. The realization that struck him was deeply unsettling. He was no longer fighting a conventional conquest operation. He was fighting something entirely new, against an enemy that didn't understand the rules of galactic warfare. And for the first time in 12,000 years of Zelkari expansion, an admiral of the Empire felt something that no Zelkari had ever experienced before: uncertainty. And of the destruction of New York should have ended human resistance. Every previous conquest had followed the same pattern: demonstrate overwhelming force, destroy a major population center, watch as the surviving leadership desperately sought terms of surrender. Instead, Admiral Kethvar found himself facing something unprecedented in Zelkari military history: The humans had gotten angry. Across the planet, instead of cowering in fear, human military units were launching coordinated attacks against the Zelkari fleet. The primitive aircraft couldn't penetrate Zelkari shields, and their missiles exploded harmlessly against energy barriers that had withstood the weapons of 100 conquered civilizations. Yet they kept coming, wave after wave, with a persistence that defied rational explanation. Admiral, reported Commander Veltham from the tactical station, were detecting multiple inbound aircraft from 17 different launch points, estimated total of over 300 human fighter craft. Threat level? Negligible. Back, their weapons cannot penetrate our shielding. However, several of their aircraft appear to be carrying nuclear warheads and are flying kamikaze attack patterns. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in irritation. The humans were wasting their lives in attacks that couldn't possibly succeed. It was irrational, inefficient, and completely contrary to the behavior patterns of every intelligent species the Zelkari had ever encountered. "Destroy them," he commanded. The Zelkari fleet's defensive systems activated, sending streams of energy that vaporized the incoming human aircraft long before they could reach their targets. Within minutes, 300 of humanity's finest pilots had been reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas. But even as the debris from the first wave settled, sensors detected another wave of incoming attacks from a completely different direction. Then another, and another. "Status report," Kethvar demanded as the tactical display lit up with hundreds of new contacts. "Sir, we're detecting coordinated attacks from 43 different locations. The humans appear to be launching every aircraft on their planet simultaneously." What Admiral Kethvar was witnessing was the largest coordinated military operation in human history. Every fighter pilot, bomber crew, and even civilian aircraft that could carry weapons had been mobilized for a single desperate assault on the alien fleet. Military commanders around the world had accepted that their forces couldn't win a conventional battle, so they weren't trying to win. They were trying to make a statement. General Hayes watched from the Pentagon's command center as every military asset at her disposal threw itself against the Zelkari fleet. The tactical displays showed a slaughter that was as inevitable as it was heartbreaking. But with each squadron that died, something extraordinary was happening. "Ma'am," reported Colonel Thompson, "we're receiving radio chatter from the alien fleet. They're confused." "Confused how? Their communications suggest they don't understand why we're continuing to attack when our weapons can't hurt them." "They keep expecting us to surrender. Are we hurting them at all? Not physically, but their formation patterns are becoming more defensive. They're treating us as a serious threat, even though their weapons are completely superior to ours." What the humans couldn't know was that their suicidal attacks were having an effect that went far beyond military damage. Admiral Kethvar was beginning to question his fundamental understanding of intelligent behavior. The humans were fighting with a ferocity and determination that had no basis in rational thought. More disturbing still, their attacks showed signs of coordination and planning that suggested they had somehow anticipated this exact scenario. Their aircraft launched from dispersed locations, followed attack patterns designed to maximize casualties among their own forces rather than minimize them, and carried weapons that were clearly intended to damage their own planet as much as the enemy. Commander Kethvar called to Veltham, "Analyze the human attack patterns. Are they following any recognizable military doctrine?" "Admiral, their tactics appear to be designed for maximum psychological impact rather than military effectiveness. They're sacrificing their forces in ways that serve no strategic purpose except to demonstrate their willingness to die rather than surrender." "That makes no rational sense." "No, sir. It doesn't." As the waves of human aircraft continued their hopeless attacks, a new development emerged that caught the Zelkari fleet completely off guard. The electromagnetic pulse that Dr. Chang's team had been preparing suddenly erupted from the planet's surface, channeling the combined output of every power grid on Earth into a single massive burst of electromagnetic energy. The pulse struck the Zelkari fleet like a hammer blow from a dying star. For the first time in 12,000 years, Zelkari shields flickered and wavered under an attack that their designers had never anticipated. Energy cascades rippled through the fleet's formation as alien technology struggled to cope with electromagnetic interference on a scale that should have been impossible for a primitive civilization to generate. "Damage report," Kethvar roared as the lights on his bridge flickered. "Cross the fleet," Veltham responded, her voice tight with what might have been fear. Shields are down to 60% efficiency. The navigation systems are showing errors. 3 destroyer-class vessels have lost main power. For a few precious moments, the Zelkari fleet was vulnerable. Human weapons that had been useless against their shields suddenly found their targets. Nuclear missiles that had been exploding harmlessly against energy barriers now detonated against the hulls of alien ships. The damage was minimal. The Zelkari vessels were too well armored to be seriously threatened by nuclear weapons. But for the first time in their empire's history, Zelkari ships had been hurt by a primitive species. Alarms that had never sounded before began wailing throughout the fleet. The psychological effect on the Zelkari was profound. These aliens had built their entire civilization on the belief that they were the apex predators of the galaxy, that their technology and military prowess made them invincible against any possible enemy. The idea that humans, primitive, weak humans, could damage their ships was beyond their ability to comprehend. Admiral Kethvar felt something that no Zelkari commander had ever experienced. Doubt. The electromagnetic pulse had been a one-time weapon, and its effects on the Zelkari fleet lasted only minutes before their systems adapted and compensated. But the psychological damage was permanent. For the first time in 12 millennia, the Zelkari faced an enemy that could hurt them. As if humanity's ability to damage Zelkari ships wasn't disturbing enough, their response to the brief window of vulnerability showed a level of tactical sophistication that shouldn't have been possible. Instead of celebrating their small victory or attempting to negotiate from a position of temporary strength, the humans did something that chilled Kethvar to his core. They escalated. The moment the Zelkari shields flickered, every nuclear submarine on Earth launched their ballistic missiles simultaneously. Not at the alien ships. Their range was insufficient, but at strategic locations around the planet. In the space of minutes, humanity deliberately destroyed its own major cities, industrial centers, and transportation networks. The explosions were visible from orbit as dozens of nuclear weapons detonated across Earth's surface. The humans were implementing a scorched earth strategy that was destroying their own civilization to deny the Zelkari the prize they had come to claim. "Admiral," Veltham reported in a voice that carried undertones of disbelief, "the humans are destroying themselves." "Explain." "They're using nuclear weapons against their own population centers. Major cities, industrial facilities, resource extraction sites. They're systematically eliminating anything that might be of value to the Empire. Mutations spreading across the human planet. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered anything like this. Conquered species sometimes destroyed military assets to prevent them from falling into Zelkari hands, but this was different. The humans were eliminating their entire technological civilization. What is their strategic objective? Unknown, Admiral. This serves no military purpose, but they're destroying their own ability to support their population. What the Zelkari couldn't understand was that humanity had made a collective decision. If they couldn't live free, then they would ensure that their conquerors gained nothing from their destruction. The nuclear bombardment wasn't a military tactic. It was the largest suicide note in galactic history. But even as their civilization burned around them, humans continued to fight. Military units that should have been vaporized in the nuclear strikes emerged from underground bunkers and began coordinating guerrilla operations. Civilian populations that should have been fleeing the destruction instead began organizing resistance networks. Most impossibly of all, the human military was somehow growing stronger rather than weaker as their planet died around them. The explanation came from an intelligence analysis that left Admiral Kethvar questioning everything he thought he knew about intelligent behavior. The humans had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades, not because they had expected an alien invasion, but because they had spent generations planning for nuclear warfare against each other. Their military doctrine included detailed plans for fighting after their civilization had been destroyed. Their soldiers were trained to operate independently without command structures. Their population was psychologically prepared for warfare under conditions that would break most species. Most disturbing of all, the destruction of their cities had eliminated the civilian infrastructure that might have made them hesitant to use the most extreme measures available to them. With nothing left to protect except their freedom, humanity was prepared to escalate their resistance to levels that defied comprehension. "Admiral," Veltham reported, We're detecting massive movement of human ground forces toward the landing zones selected for occupation troops. How many? Conservative estimate suggests over 2 million armed humans converging on our planned operational areas. They appear to be carrying improvised weapons and explosives. For 2 million? Where did they come from? Sir, analysis suggests the human population has been mobilizing since our arrival. They're not using conventional military units. These appear to be civilian volunteers armed with hunting weapons, improvised explosives, and captured military equipment. Kethvar reviewed the intelligence reports with growing unease. The standard Zelkari occupation doctrine called for establishing control over major population centers with minimal ground forces, relying on superior technology and the threat of orbital bombardment to maintain order. The doctrine assumed that conquered species would be rational enough to accept their new reality once their military forces had been eliminated. But the humans had eliminated their own infrastructure, mobilized their entire population for warfare, and were apparently preparing to fight a ground war, using tactics that maximized casualties on both sides. Instead of making conquest easier, the destruction of human civilization had somehow made it harder. Commander, what is the recommended force level for planetary occupation under current conditions? Veltham consulted her tactical analyses before responding. Sir, standard occupation protocols are insufficient. We would need to maintain continuous orbital bombardment of the entire planetary surface to prevent organized resistance. Ground occupation forces would face constant guerrilla warfare from a population that appears to have unlimited reserves and no concern for casualties. In other words, we would need to exterminate the human species entirely to secure the system. Kerosene of the planet would be required. For the first time in his career, Admiral Kafara found himself facing a decision that had no precedent in Zelkari military history. Every previous conquest had resulted in the integration of useful resources, technology, or population into the empire. The humans had made it clear that they would provide none of these benefits. Worse still, their resistance was having effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Reports were coming in from across the empire of conquered species, learning about the human resistance. Some were beginning to ask questions about Zelkari invincibility that had never been asked before. The humans weren't just resisting conquest, they were undermining the fundamental basis of Zelkari power throughout the galaxy. The psychological effect of their defiance was spreading like a virus through the Empire's vast network of subjugated worlds. As Admiral Kethvar contemplated the implications of the situation, a new transmission came from the human planet. This one was different from the defiant messages that had been broadcast earlier. It came on military frequencies and carried the formal markers of an official communication from Earth's military leadership. This is General Patricia Hayes of the United Earth Defense Force. The transmission began. We offer the following terms. Withdraw your fleet from our system immediately, and we will not pursue you. Remain in our space, and we will destroy you. The audacity of the message left Kethvar speechless. A primitive species that couldn't hurt his ships was offering him terms of surrender, with them as the victors. But as he contemplated the tactical situation, he realized that the humans might be right. They couldn't destroy his fleet, but they had already made it impossible for him to complete his mission. The Sol system was no longer suitable as a base of operations. The human population couldn't be integrated into the Empire, and the resistance movement they had created was spreading to other worlds. For the first time in 12,000 years of Zelkari expansion, Admiral Kethvar was faced with a species that had won a war by losing it completely. The question that haunted him was simple. How could the Zelkari Empire defeat an enemy that was willing to destroy itself to achieve victory? 3 months after the first contact between the Zelkari Empire and humanity, Admiral Kethvar stood in the same position before the viewing port of the Eternal Dominion. But everything had changed. The blue planet below was now scarred with the craters of nuclear detonations and orbital bombardments, its cities reduced to radioactive ruins. By every conventional measure, the humans had been utterly defeated, yet the Zelkari fleet remained in orbit, unable to complete their conquest, while reports of rebellion spread throughout the Empire like wildfire. The situation had deteriorated far beyond what anyone could have predicted. What had begun as a simple pacification operation had evolved into something that threatened the very foundation of Zelkari power. The humans had not only refused to surrender, They had somehow transformed their defeat into a victory that was reshaping galactic civilization. Admiral, Commander Veltham reported from the communication station. We're receiving another transmission from Supreme War Marshal Thekran. The holographic display activated, revealing the imposing figure of the Empire's supreme military commander. But even across the vast distance of space, Kethvar could see signs of strain in Thekran's bearing that had never been present before. Admiral Kethvar. Thekran's voice carried undertones of frustration that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Explain the current status of the Sol System operation. War Marshal, the human military forces have been eliminated. Their industrial capability has been destroyed. Their population centers have been reduced to ruins. By every standard metric, they have been comprehensively defeated. Then why? Thekran's voice rose to a barely controlled roar. Are we receiving reports of human resistance broadcasts being detected in 47 different star systems? Why are conquered species across the Empire beginning to question Zelkari authority? Why has a primitive species that cannot even reach their own system's outer planets somehow managed to inspire rebellion across our entire galactic domain? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Kethvar had no answer that would satisfy his superior, because the truth was beyond the comprehension of Zelkari military doctrine. The humans had weaponized their own destruction. In the months since the bombardment began, something unprecedented had occurred. Instead of breaking human resistance, each escalation had strengthened their resolve. Instead of eliminating their capability to fight, the destruction of their civilization had freed them from every constraint that might have limited their tactics. Most incredibly, they had somehow turned their defeat into a recruitment tool for species across the galaxy. The broadcasts that were spreading rebellion throughout the Empire weren't military communications or propaganda messages. They were simple transmissions from individual humans speaking directly to conquered species in their own languages, sharing the story of a civilization that had chosen death over slavery. My name is Maria Santos. One typical broadcast began. I was a teacher in Mexico City before the aliens came. My city is gone. My family is dead. But I am still here, and I am still free. To everyone listening to this across the galaxy, you don't have to kneel. You don't have to submit. You can choose to stand up. These messages, transmitted on primitive radio frequencies that the Zelkari had dismissed as irrelevant, were somehow reaching species that had been conquered generations ago. The technical explanation was simple enough. The humans had modified their communication satellites to broadcast on frequencies used by older technologies throughout the galaxy. Technologies that were considered obsolete but were still present on thousands of worlds. The psychological explanation was far more disturbing. For the first time in 12 millennia, conquered species were hearing from someone who had faced the Zelkari Empire and refused to surrender. The humans weren't offering military support or promising liberation. They were simply proving that resistance was possible. War Marshal, Kethvar responded carefully. The humans have employed tactics outside the scope of conventional military doctrine. They have weaponized concepts that we have no strategic countermeasures for. Explain. They have made their defeat into a form of victory. Every action we take against them reinforces their message to other species. When we bomb their cities, they broadcast the destruction as evidence that death is preferable to submission. When we eliminate their military forces, the survivors claim that their cause is so just that dying for it is an honor. When we demonstrate our overwhelming technological superiority, they use it as proof that courage matters more than strength. The Kran's expression grew darker as he absorbed this analysis. Here, you are telling me that we cannot defeat them because victory itself strengthens their position? That is correct, War Marshal. The silence that followed this admission stretched for long moments. In the background of Thekran's transmission, Kethvar could see other members of the Empire's high command moving with the urgent efficiency of an organization facing an unprecedented crisis. Admiral, Thekran finally continued, you need to understand the scope of what these humans have accomplished. In the past month alone, we have detected active rebellion in 12 star systems. Conquered species that have been peaceful for centuries are suddenly refusing to cooperate with Imperial directives. Production quotas are falling throughout the outer territories. Most seriously, we are beginning to see coordinated resistance between different species for the first time in our history. The implications were staggering. The Zelkari Empire controlled nearly 1,000 star systems through a combination of overwhelming military superiority and the psychological acceptance of their dominance by conquered peoples. If that psychological control was breaking down, the empire would need to maintain order through constant military force, something that even their vast resources couldn't sustain indefinitely. What are your orders, War Marshal? Complete sterilization of the Sol system. Distance. End their broadcasts permanently. End their broadcasts permanently. Bombardment sufficient to sterilize the planetary surface. The humans continue to operate from underground installations that we cannot locate or target effectively. Complete sterilization would require destroying the planet itself. Then destroy it. The order hung between them like a death sentence for an entire world. But Kethvar knew that even planetary destruction might not solve the problem they faced. The human message had already spread beyond their solar system, carried by radio waves that would continue propagating across the galaxy for centuries. More importantly, destroying Earth would only prove the humans' point that they had been right to choose death over submission to the Empire. War Marshal, I believe that course of action would be strategically counterproductive. Destroying their planet would validate their central message and likely accelerate the rebellion throughout our territory. Then what do you propose? For the first time in his 3-century career, Admiral Kethvar found himself completely without tactical solutions. Every option available to the Zelkari either failed to eliminate human resistance or actively strengthened it. They faced an enemy that had somehow made defeat impossible by redefining what victory meant. Before he could respond to Thekran's question, another voice interrupted their conversation. The transmission came from the surface of Earth, broadcast on open frequencies that both the Zelkari fleet and every listening species across the galaxy could receive. This is General Patricia Hayes, speaking for what remains of the human race. Her voice carried across the void with the calm authority of someone who had already accepted death and found peace with that decision. We address not only the Zelkari Empire, but every species listening to this transmission throughout the galaxy. Kethvar watched in horrified fascination as the human military leader continued her broadcast, knowing that her words were being received on hundreds of worlds where they would inspire thousands of potential rebels. For 12,000 years, the Zelkari have told you that resistance is futile. They have convinced you that their strength makes submission inevitable. They have made you believe that freedom is impossible in the face of their power. We are here to tell you that they are wrong. We are a young species. Our technology is primitive compared to theirs. Our weapons cannot penetrate their shields. Our ships cannot match their speed. By every rational measure, we should have surrendered the moment we saw their fleet. But we did not surrender. We chose to fight. We chose to resist. We chose to die free rather than live as slaves. And in making that choice, we discovered something that the Zelkari Empire has never understood. General Hayes paused, and in that moment of silence, Kethvar realized that billions of beings across the galaxy were hanging on her words. Freedom is not something that can be taken from you. It is something you can only give away. The Zelkari can destroy our cities, eliminate our armies, and even sterilize our world. But they cannot force us to kneel. They cannot make us accept their authority. They cannot conquer our spirits unless we choose to let them. To every species listening to this message, you have the same choice we have made. You can choose to resist. You can choose to be free. It doesn't matter how powerful your oppressors are. It doesn't matter how advanced their technology is. It doesn't matter if resistance seems hopeless. What matters is the choice. And that choice belongs to you. And the transmission ended, leaving absolute silence on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. Admiral Kethvar stared at the communication display, knowing that he had just witnessed something that would reshape the galaxy forever. Supreme War Marshal Thekran's image flickered back to life on the holographic display. His expression had changed from frustration to something approaching fear, an emotion that Kethvar had never seen on the face of a Zelkari military commander. Admiral, Thekran said quietly, we are receiving reports of uprisings in 17 star systems. Conquered species are declaring independence throughout the Outer Rim territories. Some are coordinating their resistance using communication protocols that match the ones developed by the humans. The scope of the catastrophe was becoming clear. The humans hadn't just resisted conquest. They had accidentally triggered the collapse of the entire Zelkari Empire. Their simple message of defiance was spreading like a virus through a galactic civilization that had been built on the assumption that resistance was impossible. War Marshal, I request permission to withdraw the fleet from the Sol system. On what grounds? The strategic objective of this operation was to secure the system for use as a military base. That objective is no longer achievable. Furthermore, our continued presence here is actively contributing to rebellion throughout the Empire. Withdrawal would allow us to concentrate our forces on suppressing uprisings in more strategically important systems. Dakran considered this proposal for long moments before responding. Admiral, if we withdraw from Sol system, it will be the first time in our history that the Zelkari Empire has retreated from a conflict with a primitive species. The psychological impact could accelerate the collapse of our authority throughout the galaxy. War Marshal, if we remain here, we validate the human claim that they have successfully resisted our empire. Either choice carries enormous risks. Then, we face a choice that has no precedent in our military history, Thekran admitted. Either we commit the resources necessary to completely eliminate every trace of human existence, regardless of the cost, or we accept that a primitive species has successfully defied the Zelkari Empire. 3. As the two Zelkari commanders contemplated impossible choices, another development was taking place across the galaxy that would render their decision irrelevant. The human broadcasts had reached species that possessed technology and resources that the Zelkari had never had to face in combination. And for the first time in 12,000 years, multiple conquered civilizations were beginning to coordinate their resistance efforts. The humans had given them something more powerful than weapons or technology. They had given them hope. The message was simple. If a primitive species armed with chemical rockets and nuclear weapons could resist the Zelkari Empire, then civilizations with more advanced technology might be able to do more than just resist. They might be able to win. Admiral Kethvar received the news of coordinated rebellions throughout the Empire with the growing realization that the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. Without leaving their own star system, without possessing faster-than-light travel, without advanced weapons or superior technology, they had somehow managed to destabilize the greatest military empire the galaxy had ever known. They had weaponized the concept of freedom itself. 6 months after first contact with humanity, the Zelkari Empire began the largest military redeployment in their history, pulling fleets from throughout their territory to suppress rebellions on hundreds of worlds. The Sol system, which had seemed like such a minor operation, had become the epicenter of a galactic revolution. And on the surface of a small blue planet, the scattered remnants of humanity continued their resistance, now knowing that their choice to fight had given hope to billions of beings across the galaxy who had thought freedom was impossible. The strongest empire in galactic history had encountered humanity and discovered something they had never learned in 12,000 years of conquest. Sometimes losing a war is the only way to win it.